Good morning. I hope that this particular day for you, is a great day of peace. We're all longing for peace in lots of ways right now, and I hope that it's in your life today. Certainly, Jesus offers us peace in a way that the world never does. And that may kind of bring us to an interesting conflict in human nature today, because while we are seeking peace, we find something that Jesus is promising us that sounds like anything but peace. We've been talking about the Beatitudes now for a number of days. And in each one of those Beatitudes, we've talked about things that take us closer to be like Jesus. And so we are anxious to follow him because we see that in following him, we are blessed in some very special ways. And so now we get down to the very last of those Beatitudes. And if we had not read ahead, if we were just taking these one at a time and we didn't know what was coming, we might have expected that the last Beatitude would be maybe the greatest blessing of all, and something that we really anticipate looking forward to and practice. And in fact, it is, but it is certainly not what we might expect. We might have expected this last Beatitude to be kind of the ultimate reward for following him. But instead of a reward, here we are in the last Beatitude, and it talks about we are blessed when we are persecuted. And what's interesting, being persecuted is our reward. Every step along the way has prepared us to be more and more like Jesus. So, if we are walking with Jesus in all of these other ways, should we be surprised if our journey takes us to the same place that it took Jesus? It took Jesus to the cross, and evidently that's where it leads us as well. Should we expect our devotion to the things of God to give us ease and glory, and yet those very same things gave Jesus pain and suffering? Hasn't he been telling us all the way along that we should take up our cross? Well, Christian, here's the cross. The evidence, when we look around the world today, if we read a number of news sources, we can find out that evidently there are more people today dying for their Christian faith than have ever died in the history of the world. Now, we certainly don't see that in America. We don't see that in the Western world really at all. But there are places in Africa and places particularly in Southwest Asia where being a Christian is a threatening position to be in. And indeed, there are a great many people who are suffering. We think about persecution being like in the Roman Colosseum. And indeed, there were hundreds of Christians that were put to death in the Colosseum as entertainment for the rest of the city to watch. And that seems so evil in our sight. Indeed it is. But the number of people that are dying for their Christian faith today is far more than died in Rome. So, where does that lead us? Isn't it strange? And just kind of philosophically step back and ask this question, isn't it strange that there would be some who would hate Christ so much and consequently hate his followers so much that they could justify killing? But honestly, looking at all of history, I don't suppose we should be surprised at that. Jesus was put to death. Most of the apostles were put to death. One of the earliest, well, actually the earliest recording of a Christian martyr was so early that it took place and is recorded in the book of Acts in chapter 7 when Stephen died at the hands of those who were stoning him to death. And one of those young men that was standing there consenting to Stephen's death was a young man named Saul, who later we would know as the Apostle Paul. But there were people dying for their faith. The prophets in the Old Testament were dying for their faith. And certainly when we get into the New Testament and in the first few centuries following the birth of Christianity, there were a great many Christians who were put to death, caused to suffer in a great many ways. So why? Why do some feel the necessity to persecute others? We look at the goodness of Christianity and we think this is good for all humankind, and indeed it is. So why are there those that want to persecute? Well, there is an answer. And the answer is as simple as this: evil hates good. Jesus was the highest level of goodness. And those who saw him, who listened to him, who heard what he was teaching, they were either persuaded to follow him or they were inclined to kill him. So if he or his followers were persecuted in such a way, then should we think that that has changed? Because certainly we know that human nature has not changed. If he or his followers were willing to compromise with the world and not be quite so rigid in their beliefs, they might not have died. But the Christian faith, the pure Christian faith, the uncompromised Christian faith, cannot be bent in that sort of way. We cannot compromise our faith and still call it Christian. The faith is what it is designed to be. We hold to a standard of teaching that is not compromisable. And so either we are true to that or we compromise to the world, compromise with the world. And so we have to face the reality. If we are going to be Christians, in the purest sense of the word, there will be persecution that comes our ways. One of the earliest observations of the early Christians was that their beliefs were unbendable. And for this reason, they actually gained a lot of followers, because people are attracted to something that is strong, steadfast, a rock upon which they can build their house, if you will, going back to Jesus' teachings. People are attracted to that sort of thing. But there are also people that are repelled to think that their lives are invaded by this other teaching that is ultimately good. But if your life is surrounded by evil, if your life is based on evil, then you're going to hate those who practice the goodness. So all of this brings us back to the passage that we are talking about today, and that is the passage that says, "Blessed are those who have been persecuted." So we ask the question, how is that a blessing? How is it a blessing for us to be persecuted and suffer? Well, first of all, suffering for Christ, it places us in that elite group of followers, that elite group of Christians who are willing to pay the price and suffer with Christ. Consider this amazing verse that Paul wrote to the Colossian Christians. He said this, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I do my share on behalf of his body, which is the church, in filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions." Paul was rejoicing because he was honored to suffer with Jesus. It takes a mature faith to have that kind of an attitude. Second, the reason that suffering, being persecuted, is a blessing is because it separates us, it sets us apart from all those who would have a weaker and less challenged faith. There's a refining process that goes on in us that makes us purer and stronger because we experience suffering for our faith. So really, we get down to this question: how many of us have suffered for our Christian faith. Now, I don't mean in some way that somebody says something about us that's so shallow. But have we really suffered? Actually, some have. Some have suffered for their commitment to their faith because they have been rejected by family and friends. Indeed, that has happened. Some have suffered because they've even had to leave a job or move away from a situation that interfered with their faith. But for the most part, our Christian faith has been pretty easy to claim. But then, here is the promise from Jesus that there is reward in suffering and that suffering will come. Gives us pause, doesn't it? Are we ready? Am I ready? Are you? That suffering could come sooner than we might have ever expected. Most of us would have never thought that in our lifetime we would ever have to suffer, pay a price for our faith. But in fact, that could happen. Why? Because evil still hates good, and evil seems to be getting stronger and stronger. So how are we to react with the reality that there is this surrounding evil that wants to do things that are terrible to those who believe? How should we react to that? Well, I'll tell you very clearly, we should rejoice because we will be honored to stand with Jesus. We will be honored even to die with Jesus. Have a peaceful day. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope.